Today is Tuesday, May 12th. This is VOA's International Edition. I'm Lori Lundin in Washington. Coming up, White House staffers describe close quarters and concerns about spreading coronavirus.
You had Kevin Hassett, who was one of the president's top economic advisors through all of this, on one of the Sunday talk shows talking about how scary it is to go into the building every day.
South Africans weary after 6 weeks of lockdown wonder when it will end. Also ahead, together but apart, some big pop artists pair up for a quarantine music video. It's all on today's International Edition. As U.S. President Donald Trump pushes the nation to reopen, he is also confronting cases of the coronavirus in the White House itself. While staffers are being regularly tested, reporters at a news conference on Monday asked why Americans are not able to get tests.
If people want to get tested, they get tested. But for the most part, they shouldn't want to get tested. There's no reason. They feel good. They don't have sniffles. They don't have sore throats. They don't have any problem.
Trump went on to take aim at the nation's Democratic governors, accusing them of not wanting to open their states.
There just seems to be no effort on certain blue states to get back into gear, and the people aren't going to stand for it. They want to get back.
There have been at least 2 known positive cases of COVID-19 among White House staffers, which has put 3 of the nation's top medical experts in quarantine for being in contact with the people. While it's one of the most protected complexes in America, AP correspondent Darlene Superville says staffers are worried about working in the cramped quarters.
But when you get right down to it, there's still people with feelings and emotion. And I think the people that work there can't help but be concerned after the back-to-back reports last week of the president's valet being tested positive for coronavirus, and then the vice president's press secretary also being tested positive for coronavirus.
She says while it's a prestigious place full of high-powered and hard-charging officials, they know that no one is immune from getting this virus.
The West Wing is a very old, cramped workspace, lots of small offices next to one another, and everyone is passing each other in these narrow hallways, going back and forth to multiple meetings every day. So there is definitely a feeling of concern there among staffers and the White House, and those particularly in the West Wing.
The U.S. coronavirus death toll has now topped 80,000. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says New York City also may have thousands more fatalities than the official numbers kept by the city and state. A CDC analysis says between mid-March and early May, about 24,000 more people died in the city than researchers would ordinarily expect. Meanwhile, as countries begin to lift lockdowns, a top World Health official warned Monday that if countries reopen their economies without setting up strong contact tracing, testing, and isolation of those who test positive, the virus will take off again.
Shutting your eyes and trying to drive through this blind is about as silly an equation as I've seen. And I'm really concerned that certain countries are setting themselves up for some seriously blind driving over the next few months.
Dr. Michael Ryan, the World Health Organization's emergencies chief, said it's an uncomfortable reality, but nations must not be in denial.
We're seeing some hope as many countries exit these so-called lockdowns, and this is good. It allows economic life to return. But extreme vigilance is required, and not just vigilance. Many countries, as the DG has said, have made very systematic investments in building up their public health capacities during the lockdowns. Others have not.
Germany earlier reported an acceleration in new coronavirus infections after it took early steps to ease its lockdown. South Korea, another country that had succeeded in limiting virus infections, has also seen a new outbreak in nightclubs. Lebanon is on alert for a potential second wave of coronavirus cases following an alarming increase in local infections over the weekend. But some Lebanese say they fear dying of hunger more than from COVID-19, the illness caused by the virus, as the tiny Mediterranean country's economic and financial crisis worsens. Dale Gavlak reports from Amman on Lebanon's economic uncertainty as the country grapples with the coronavirus.
Authorities in Lebanon say they had to strengthen measures against violators and extend a countrywide nightly curfew by 2 hours amid a spike in coronavirus cases, some involving people returning from abroad. Health Minister Kevin Hassett said one case involved a Lebanese returnee who should have isolated for 14 days, but caused the transmission of infection to his family and to the people around him. Officials warn Lebanon might be locked down for 48 hours to conduct a field study in areas where the cases were found. The latest reports put the number of COVID-19 infections at 859 with 26 deaths. The coronavirus pandemic has compounded economic woes in Lebanon, which had plunged deep into financial crisis months before. Lebanese have seen the value of their savings tumble, with the currency, the pound, losing more than half its value. Food prices have soared. Nearly 50% of Lebanese are living below the poverty line, and unemployment stands at 35%, according to the government. Many employed have seen their salaries slashed in half. Professor Habib Malik of the Lebanese American University tells VOA that hunger is driving anti-government protesters back to the streets, following a spate of mass protests.
People are in such dire straits here. They're actually throwing caution to the wind when it comes to the virus and risking going out because the situation is so bad. There is famine, poverty, bankruptcy, and people will say, okay, if we're going to die, we might as well try and fight before we die rather than sit at home and avoid the virus and then starve to death. This is a very bleak kind of choice. It's scary.
The government and commercial banking sector are currently fighting over a plan to rescue the ailing economy, which is $91 billion in debt. The plan would include negotiations with the International Monetary Fund. Malik says potential IMF aid will likely bring more misery to ordinary Lebanese, who blame the entrenched political elite for years of corruption and mismanagement, and whom they see as responsible for the current mess.
This plan does not address some of the very basic issues. Corruption, the repatriation of stolen funds. Repatriating stolen funds is a very slow and very difficult process that would require sustained legal pursuit of the culprits, international cooperation. The banks made huge profits as a result of the high interest they were giving people, and they were also benefiting from that. They siphoned out of Lebanon tens of billions of dollars, and we don't know where they are.
Lebanon's Prime Minister Hassan Diab said the government would ask for more than $10 billion from the IMF in the first phase of the loan plan. The IMF is expected to say it wants to see prior action on reform before the country asks for financial assistance. The United Nations in Lebanon has launched an emergency appeal requesting $350 million to help people who are most acutely at risk due to the COVID-19 outbreak and its immediate socioeconomic impact. While Malik and others welcome the call, analysts believe it's a drop in the bucket, and there's always the question of how the money will be used. Dale Gavlik for VOA News, Amman.
South Africa is entering its 7th week of restrictions in an attempt to slow the spread of coronavirus. Top officials say the measures have made a difference in transmission, but critics are calling for them to end more quickly, saying the restrictions are now themselves a burden on a population which has long struggled with inequality, poverty, and unemployment. VOA's Anita Powell reports from Johannesburg.
To say South Africa is tired of the lockdown would be a gross understatement. Officials acknowledge the effect that a curfew and limitations on movement are having on the population's financial and mental health, but say they are holding firm against a bigger health threat, that of a virus that has killed 3.2% of those known to be infected in the World Health Organization's African region. The global death rate is about 7%, according to WHO statistics. The head of the opposition Democratic Alliance, John Steenhuisen, threw these provocative words at the ruling African National Congress.
We're no longer dealing with a COVID-19 crisis. We are dealing with a lockdown crisis, an ANC lockdown crisis, to be precise. Let me be very clear. There is no longer a justification to keep this hard lockdown in place. Government cannot even produce the justification. They cannot show us the modeling they use to decide when to ease and when to tighten restrictions. They cannot do this because they don't seem to know for sure themselves.
The initial 5-week hard lockdown, which has now been replaced by slightly loosened restrictions, was aimed at buying the health system time to prepare for an inevitable wave of infections. Critics argue that that time is up, and that the harm done to livelihoods outweighs the risks faced by easing the restrictions. Most of the country is currently under what is known as Phase 4 of the eased lockdown, with a nighttime curfew and reduced shopping hours in place. The sale of alcohol and cigarettes remains illegal. Although several key sectors of the economy have gone back to work, many South Africans remain at home, unable to do so. Shabir Mahdi, professor of vaccinology at the University of the Witwatersrand, urged more targeted testing and screening, and huge improvements to water and sanitation. The lockdowns, he said, aren't enough.
And if we can't do that, unfortunately, what we're setting up ourselves for, irrespective of what policy government has, right? If we're not able to abide by those sort of conditions, if we can't create an environment for people to actually practice those sort of interventions, we're going to have a much quicker rate of transmission of the virus, and we're going to get a surge much sooner, and the peak with this wave probably will be much greater than we expect if those non-pharmaceutical interventions don't work.
At this time, the government is holding firm in its positions. Over the weekend, Health Minister Zweli Mkhize noted an alarming rise in new infections in the Western Cape and threatened that the nation may see a return to a total lockdown or heightened interventions of various forms in some areas where transmission is high. Steenhuisen opposes that.
The real tragedy playing out here is no longer the coronavirus, but the lockdown itself, because this lockdown is going to cost many more lives than it can possibly save.
President Cyril Ramaphosa has yet to say publicly when the restrictions might end. But in its Monday newsletter, the president said the nation was stepping up its testing, screening, and treatment regime. He noted the transition to the next phase of the coronavirus response, that of recovery, will be more difficult than the present one. Anita Powell, VOA News, Johannesburg.
Here are some of the other stories we're following at VOA. Germany reported on Monday that new cases of coronavirus were accelerating exponentially after early steps to ease its lockdown. News that sounded a global alarm even as businesses from Paris hair salons to Shanghai Disneyland began to reopen. Germany's Robert Koch Institute reported that the reproduction rate, the number of people each person infected with the coronavirus goes on to infect, had risen to 1.1. Any rate above 1 means the virus is spreading exponentially. Hong Kong authorities said Monday they arrested 230 people during a pro-democracy protest over the weekend after a sing-along demonstration at a shopping mall spilled out onto the streets of the Chinese-ruled city. Hundreds of riot police were deployed to disperse the protesters, with some members of the media caught up in the chaos. The actions evoked memories of the sometimes violent unrest that rocked the global financial hub there last year. And Iran's Navy says one of its warships accidentally struck another with a missile during an exercise, killing 19 sailors and wounding 15 others. The incident took place during training in the Gulf of Oman, a sensitive waterway that connects to the Strait of Hormuz, through which about a fifth of the world's oil passes. Iran regularly conducts exercises in the area. Stay with VOA for all the latest U.S. and world news.